This has been an interview by Dana Jackson with James Dewing, who has discussed the years of his life during the Depression with us. Thank you.
James Dewing was brought up on West Newton Hill, and he attended Newton High School in the years just prior to the Great Depression. The interview made March 13, 1979.
Junior or senior in high school. It was in that time that our family started to feel the slowing down of industry. My father was in industrial engineering, and all of a sudden there wasn't enough money to go to do things, and father left and went chasing industrial activity, which left New England, and he went first to New York and then further west. And so when I got out of high school, I went to art school, and that was during that period that the big crash that everybody felt came. And I suppose tuition had been paid for the first section of my career in art, and the family had no money, and I moved in with a boy who had a room over in Gainsborough Street, and I started to say, how does a fellow make a living? I had no background or training, and I was a hell of a good dancer. And so I said that I'd always been taught, do what you do best. So I got a job with a dance studio teaching dancing. And when you say you got a job, today you think of $100 or $200 a week. I'm talking about making somewhere between $3 and $10 a week, depending on how many people wanted to come in and see me. And with this amount of money, this fellow that had the room in Gainesville, we moved down onto Columbus Avenue and had a room there. The family, in the meantime, were in this kind of situation. I was watching the Gone with the Wind the other night and thinking about how these southern people couldn't believe that an era was coming to an end, and that's the way our family was. My father, for example, went out and mortgaged a chattel mortgage on all the contents of our home for $300. And the house was full of antiques and oriental rugs and thousands of books. It was just a travesty. But that $300 chattel mortgage could not be paid off because there was no money. And the people who made that loan took the entire contents of our home, and it was just ludicrous that these things happened. You just had no foresight. You just, borrow $300, we'll pay that back next week. Instead of that, the whole business went. And in that same time frame, you see, I was living in Boston. Mother was forced to leave with my younger brother and lived on the back of Beacon Hill in a 1.5 room apartment. And at that point, there were two classes of people in Boston. There were those that had been wise enough to frugally have money, cash, and those that didn't. And those that didn't couldn't get work. There was no jobs. There was just nothing. You could go out and spend 10 hours a day looking for a job of work to pay you $10 a week, and you couldn't find one. But the people, I was fortunate enough to have some contact with people who had not only had money in the bank, but they also were wise enough at the time of the bank closing. You were familiar with the fact that Roosevelt closed all the banks. They had cash, that was green stuff, and they were kind enough to find a way to get some of this green stuff into my hands, making me feel that I was earning it, but it was really their concern for Jim Dewing and his needs. I know that in retrospect. At the time, I salved my conscience about taking this money. And I'm talking about $10 at a time. I'm not talking about thousands. I'm just talking about, and this went on through, see, the crash was 29. That was the year that I went to art school. That was my graduating year of high school, Newton High School. And it was my first year in art school. The Rooseveltian election took place in 32. So we're talking about that dull span when I was dancing for a living, making somewhere around $5 a week, living alone. My roommate eventually moved out in a room on Columbus Avenue, and I used to have my linen and housekeeping, a gas plate in the room, down the hall to the bar for $5 a week. If I could get someone to live with me, it was $2.50 a week. And a landlady, an old Irish gal that always was very sweet to me, and she said slowly I kept getting over more and more rent money that I hadn't paid. She said, "There's one thing about you, Mr. Dewing, when you have it, you give it to me. I always trust you, dear Mrs. Donovan." Anyway, in retrospect, I know that I was starving at that time, that those of us who didn't have enough to have 3 square meals, I can remember coming back from an evening at the studio and buying some sort of worn out bananas and a bag of peanuts, and that might be all that I had to eat that day. And I didn't realize it. I didn't realize that I was doing this. Remember, if you had 25 or 30 cents in your pocket, you could buy groceries. It was not, you didn't have to have $30 to buy a few groceries. You could buy milk and that sort of thing for very little money. You didn't have to have much money to get something to eat. And then I was very fortunate. Up on Massachusetts Avenue, there was a delicatessen that quality food shop, and it was run by 2 brothers. They were Jews and a sister, I think, or a wife. Anyway, they knew what situation I was in, and those people would I'd go in for a cup of coffee or even just for a glass of water, and they'd insist that I sit at the counter and have a good meal. They'd punch up, I don't know if you've ever seen these dinner checks with money. They'd punch out whatever the meal was and put it on a spindle because I didn't have any money. And that stack, those people kept feeding me. And of course, I was very frugal as to how many times I let them do it, but they insisted, "Come in, Jimmy, and anytime you want it, you have what food you want." And that stack of checks got to be about a foot deep. Well, that was the depth as far as I was concerned. And remember, I wasn't feeling sorry for myself because there were loads of us in just about the same position. And I was fortunate that I had no obligations. Think of the families that had obligations and no money, nothing.
What was your father doing at the time?
He was still chasing the will-o'-the-wisp, and then he came home sick. He was a beaten man, and he came home, and he had had 1 stroke, and then he had a series of strokes. But when he came home, it was, I would guess, about late 1933. And my brother and mother were living on Beacon Hill, and he moved in with them. They got a larger place, and at this point, and it must have been in 32 or 33, that we all decided it was better to move in with Mother, and whatever we had would work better there than living alone up on Columbus Avenue. So we all moved up onto Beacon Hill. I eventually, through having a contact with a man who was a vice president of Charlotte Bank. Remember, during this period, I was out looking for work, sometimes as much as 8 hours a day. I would go to agencies and cold turkey into places trying to find a place to work. I went to a fellow that was a great Dartmouth football player, and his daughter and I grew up together, and he was the president of Boston Main Railroad. So I went in to see Joe Gilman, and I said, Joe, I'm really desperate. I need a job. Gee, Jim, you really do. Well, he said, I have a list of men that I'm trying to get jobs for. And he said, you know Jimmy Benson, he was my favorite, and he's looking for a job. And Al Masters, who was the great Dartmouth football player, he's number 2. You go in as number 3 as soon as the job opens. And I said, thank you very much, Joe. He was the kind of man you call by the first name. Mm-hmm. I said, I'm looking for a job to sweep out the North Station or anything that you can get. Oh, he said, we just laid off 300 men. And the reason I was there was that the newspapers that day had published that B&M had hired 200 people. Mm. But he said, that's not true. He said, we just laid off 300 today. So, anyway, through this man at Charlotte Bank, I said, I was trying to, for a long time I had pride. I was going to get a job on my own, but now I was using every contact that I could think of to get something to do. So I went to Henry Nichols, who was vice president of Charlotte Bank. And he sat on the foyer there in the old Water Street. He yelled out, what's my radio connection? I had told him that in high school I had worked for Dimmock and Turner, and radio and sold phonograph records and that sort of thing. So, what's my radio connection? So that's his connection. The company that was borrowing money from him was World Radio. World Radio turned out to be Mr. Ernest Henderson, who later became Mr. Sheridan. Sheridan Hotel chain. Well, I went over to see Ernest Henderson, and he said, well, the president is talking about NRA, that's the National Recovery Act, and is asking us to hire people. So we said, I guess it's my patriotic duty to put you on. $14 a week, 6 days a week, no time kept. It was 8 o'clock in the morning and sometimes until 9 o'clock at night in that retail store. And through my interest in using my bean and having an opportunity to talk to this man in the evening when he would be working at his desk, he'd call me over and he'd tell me his problems at World Radio. And I would go home and dream about the problem and come back with solutions. And every week, for weeks, I had an extra $1. And every time I'd go back and say, somebody made a mistake this morning, I got an extra $1. And I always said, that was me. And, till I got up to about $35 a week, and I was a king. $35 a week, and that was in 1932 or 33. And you can't imagine what a man, single man, without any responsibilities, could do with $35 a week. I was a king. I bought a car, I went to theater, I did just about anything I wanted. And then I finally got a job with Philco Radio, $50 a week plus expenses. And I thought that this was millennium. And I should have stayed with Henderson because he expanded into the Sheraton Hotel chain. And I was his white-haired boy, but he had put a bum in to run World Radio, and I couldn't stand it. And I went over and complained to him twice. Years later, I sat out in Lincoln with Henderson on the backyard of his, he bought the Lee Higginson estate out in Lincoln. We were sitting in the backyard, and I said, well, Hendy, I got to know him that, call him that later. I said, Hendy, I made one big mistake in my life, and that's when I walked out to go with Philco without coming to see you. And he said, well, I made a big mistake by hiring the man that made you leave me. He said, that was the biggest mistake in my business life. And he said, you read it, but he said, I was just about ready to get rid of him when you left. But I was on the board of directors of the investment companies. He is a straw vote, but he had put me into, of course I came from the Charlotte Bank, you see, I was a banker. But anyway, I made my decision and had left and thought I was getting into something, but the Philco job took me to New York State traveling. Well, this isn't what you didn't want, a personal history, but these things give you a flavor of the depth of the Depression. From here on, the Depression never really ended through this period. In my opinion, the Depression, unemployment, difficulty of finding a job, the hammer that the employer had over you for fear of losing any lousy job that you might have. You always had the hammer of more people trying to get in than those that hadn't work. Until Hitler and the outbreak of the invasion of Poland and the lowlands, and Roosevelt started into a program we called it the National Defense Program. And at that point, when we started building a national defense in this country under Roosevelt, this was back in 38, 39, that was when I think the Depression started really to turn the corner to prosperity in this country. And of course, in the meantime, Roosevelt started a ball rolling of federal spending that was considered outrageous by conservatives. And I can remember, how are we doing? I can remember the terrible fear that people had of Rooseveltian extravagance when the national budget went to $4 billion. The total federal budget under this spendthrift Roosevelt was $4 billion. And of course, you know what's happened since then. But he was the one that really started making the federal government the important factor. It was no longer local option. Local governments became a federal. Now, what else do you want to know? That's my personal experience abbreviated through that period.
It's terrific. Good call. How has the Depression affected you now? I mean, what things do you see in yourself now that you...
Having lived through those pre-Depression years when things went wrong in our family, as money got from relative affluence to silly privation, and watching my poor mother take the checks that came in from my father and trying to pay bills that were twice as much as the check, and that strain, and all the things that happened to our home and our contents of our home and all the silly things that were in hindsight, ludicrous that anybody should get into that economic position, has flavored my life economically to the point where, in an economy where I should have been in debt up to my ears, I've never been in debt in my life. Whatever we've ever owned, we paid for when we bought it. And this was I would probably be a millionaire today if I had been smart enough to be a debt-ridden family with anybody that got into debt in the early days of our present inflationary period and paid off all their debts with the cheap money that we're in now could have made a fortune, both on the fact that you go into debt to accumulate enough money to make investments in an inflationary market or real estate or whatever you went into. So the Depression babies, and I think I'm not alone in this, it was the older people, the ones that really were hurt by the Depression, watched it actually hurt families, have been so cautious in their economic lives that we have hurt ourselves economically, no question. There's no question in my mind that if I had had the courage to go on tick for anything and owned a lot of money and paid it off with cheap dollars, that would have been great. When we bought this house, I went down to the bank and they wanted a 4.5% mortgage. And I said, I thought that you had 4.25% mortgages. And he said, oh, well, if you were able to make another $1,000 down payment, I could give you a 4.25%. And I said, let's stop now and let me go out and see what I can do. And I went out and scratched around and I found the extra 1,000. So we got a 4.25% mortgage. Now, if I'd been smart, I would have taken a 40-year mortgage. Instead of that, I took the shortest period mortgage you could. I wanted to get it done and over with. So that was just the wrong thing, and that's Depression thinking. The fear of owing money that might have to be paid off with expensive money. Because once you have seen the dollar go so low, what I mean is that the prices go so low that the dollar will buy 5 times as much. You're always, when I bought this house for $10,000, I said to Elaine, we've just kicked $2,000 out. A real estate man was here the other day and said that if I ever wanted to sell it, I said, you can easily get $70,000. I said to Elaine, we'll never get $10,000 back. But since we're desperate and want the house, we've got to take it. I was sure I was wasting. That's Depression thinking. Every time anything happens, I think, well, now there'll be a depression, and all these values will go to hell. Today, the economists are preaching depression. They have for the last 6 months been preaching that we're going to have a depression. Some call it recession, but the word depression has come into some of the economists' writing. And strangely, I was reading as recently as this morning that all economic indicators show that there is no recession, that the recession they're all sure is going to come. None of the economic indicators show that it's going to happen. Excuse me.
Many older people that I've spoken to said that they think that the Depression and World War II has made it too easy for people of my generation. Do you agree with this? You know, the feeling of apathy that seems to be in the air sometimes?
Yeah. I think that what I have felt is that I was telling you how we were in fear of our jobs. I feel that in the last 30 years, there have been so many jobs available that men have been able to pick and choose. Now, we've had a short period of time with unemployment recently, but you don't have a sense that people are fearing their jobs. Young people come to work and they're dilettante. They don't really knuckle in and do a real job of work. And I was very critical and very fearful of, I still am to some extent, of the fact that when we were running a stock room, or when we had shipments to make, if we had a customer to take care of, we would break our backs to see to it that that job was efficiently and properly and correctly performed. Today, if it doesn't suit me today, I'll take care of it. Don't get up in a heat, don't worry about it. I'll take care of it, This kind of attitude is something that I think that you have felt people saying. On the other side of this coin, I have seen kids of mine who had the same experience. That is, they've been able to get jobs easily, no problem. But one of my boys is running a very important plant, full charge of a production plant out of Cummins Diesel Engine Company, and doing a as conscientious as I ever was in my best days. I have another son that worked for Boston Cycles in Boston in charge of their stockroom, and he was prouder of the way he operated and the way he handled his men and so forth. And so I have watched in my own family an opposite to what I have been saying to you about the dilettante, uninterested kids that I think there's only a short period, and when they start to get their teeth into the job, they do take hold. We have a young man who is a serviceman working for us, and I was over at H.K. Porter's yesterday, and the man in charge of the well-being of that big plant there said, "You know who was at my elbow yesterday? Charlie. And there is no better man that I've ever known in this man's life than Charlie. He is so conscientious, and so thorough in the way he does things." And this is the same generation that we're talking about. So generalization is pretty bad. I do think that factories in shipping rooms, I tried to get an answer out of a shipping room today and got an absolutely indifferent answer. And it's vital to our business. It's vital to my life. And they have every right to serve me. They have every reason to serve me. And yet, I can't talk to you about that now. I'm asking, what are you going to do about delivering an order that you got last November and promised me March delivery? I want to know because I have customers waiting for it. Can't talk to you. I'll have to do this another day. I can't bother about it. I said, what am I going to do? I felt as though I was pushing into an air balloon and I was making no impact on the man. Now this sort of thing is happening through industry, where in the old days you could get a crystal answer and be pretty certain that the answer was accurate. We feel this today, and I think I blame it not just on careless individuals, but rather on a general attitude. So that's two sides. I'm saying two different things. Are we running out? Me.
Another couple of minutes on this one.
Well, tell me what else you... That's a long answer to a simple question.
Well, I was wondering, now before the Depression, you were going to Newton North? Well, then it was just Newton High School.
Yeah.
When that was a time of prosperity, wasn't it?
Yeah.
How did you and your friends first react as a group, as like your friends as a whole? What was the feeling when it first started to? I know there was that feeling of, I don't think it's going to happen, that doubtful feeling, but how was the reaction on the whole? How did the whole impact affect Newton?
I'm not a good person to answer that because I've told you our experience. But our experience was a little ahead of time. It wasn't a question of not believing that it was going to happen or could happen, but rather that something was wrong with the Doing family. You see, the others were not feeling it. As a matter of fact, when we couldn't pay our bills was the time that people were making fortunes in the pyramiding market in Wall Street. We didn't have any money to... Father's business went to hell, and I think probably bad business judgment, but no, I know. With what happened in Newton, you've got to realize I was out of Newton. I was gone when this happened. I was living in Boston. The actual close down on Mother and the house happened almost simultaneously with market crash and security. Her moving to Boston was for that. And so I really must confess I was licking wounds and not looking back to Newton. And I can't tell you my experience with the people in Boston that I described to you, the two types of people. One group of people had security, had investments that hadn't been wiped out. A lot of people made money in that crash, solid sure. Some people saw it. And there were those that foresaw the bank closing and had cash in their hands, and there was the rest of us that was a growing multitude that didn't have anything. I'm sure this same sort of thing was happening in Newton, but I can't describe it to you because I wasn't in Newton. I don't know what happened, but I'm sure that it was general. That is, that there would be people that lived in Newton that had security, they had holdings that were not affected, that they weren't selling, they weren't buying lots of stocks on margin. You see, that was what really killed a lot of people, was the fact that they invested much too heavily in this pyramidal market on a very thin margin. Then the market would dip and they would wipe out their bonds and their cash and so forth to try to cover, not believing that the thing wasn't just going to dip, but it went bang right now, and they got wiped out. But there were lots of smarter people. There were many smarter people that had good securities and went through that. And of course, if you had a few $1,000s in the bank, you could buy the world. You could buy anything if you had a dollar bill. There was just, things went down so low in price that people can't believe it. People won't believe that for 15 cents you could get a full course meal. I mean, soup and entree. There was a great chain of restaurants in Boston called Child's that served excellent food, and they had a place down after the Stafford office building. And my brother lived with me on Columbus Avenue for a while just before he was married, and his future wife had moved into another room in Mrs. Donovan's establishment, and we scratched together $3 and went down to Child's on Sunday, because Child's allowed you to eat as their guests on Sunday for $1, which meant you could have oysters on the half shell, and you could have fish, steak, chicken, as much as you could eat. And we would go down there with great big eyes, you know, and a dollar bill, and we'd start eating. And of course, not having had enough to eat for a couple of years, we couldn't eat more than one healthy. You know, you went down thinking, I'm going to eat my way right through this whole menu. But you just couldn't do it. They didn't get eaten. You went down to beat them. But these are things people can't believe that what it was. When I got, years later, I used to buy the kind of shoes that I'm wearing, a last that particularly suited me, for $5 a pair. The last time I bought them, this is low-price legal shoes. Last time I had them made, because they dropped this last out of the line, it cost me $47 a pair to have them made. And the other day I talked to them and they said they'd be $75 if they could get the factory to make it. That was $5.
Could you give me some specific memories you have? Just a few of the depression that really stand out in your mind. Experiences, or just when you think of it, just the type of memories that come back.
One of the things that was probably one of the most vivid memories I've had are memories of going into the New York subway entrances and seeing hundreds of people in the warmth coming up out of those tunnels under newspapers, sleeping on the concrete. Not a couple of bums. I mean hundreds of people using those entrances for the subway. That memory is so vivid in my mind that I'll never forget that scene. I think that the memory of the quality food shop and being allowed to eat there at my will and never pay anything, they just let me sign a check. For years that went. By the way, I went back when I got my job at World Radio. I would go back and eat there and always buy back 2 checks for every meal I had. I bought them all back eventually, but those people just had such big hearts that it was, these were the things that you remember with such warmth. Mrs. Donovan, never pressing me, always saying, I know, Mr. King, you have it, you give it to me. She got all her money back.
I think a lot of people work together more during the Depression.
Much more, yeah. More, there was a very, very little, now remember, I said I lived in Columbus Avenue. Columbus Avenue was not as black then as it is now, but it was plenty black. And I used to go into a black restaurant that made good pork chops, and there was no sense of tension or unpleasantness at all. Never had any roughness. Now, I guess I'm the only one in the company that will survey work in certain parts of Rochester. And our men won't work over it. They go over with the truck and they're ripped off before they get out of their truck. And it's a frightening situation. But I lived in the middle of this same group of people and had no troubles at all. Never had any problems. They were nice, and I tried to be nice. Never any difficulty. Yeah, that's one of the memories of the harmony, the feeling of oneness of all of us in trouble. Also, my radical period came just before Roosevelt, too. I was a soapbox orator for a while. My knowledge of economics was very limited, but I listened to the Marxian philosophy because I had worked out in my mind an absurdity that there was a depression and people were in terrible want, and the reason for this want was there were lots of goods in the warehouses that nobody could afford to buy, and therefore nobody could go to work, And it was just a silly impasse that here in a paradise of plenty, we were starving because the system had broken down. That is, you had warehouses full of goods, no need of any further production or jobs. So I started listening to some of the socialists and got involved in my mind and my heart with radical philosophy. So that's another memory I have, is standing on the soapbox of Boston Common and preaching the philosophy of socialism. I think that was, I have always felt that had Roosevelt not started the ball rolling in his rah-rah college techniques that he used when he first went into the White House, that this country was very close to radical overthrow. It was unbelievable how many people. This was not just on Boston Common. This was not just in some of the meetings that I'd go to in various halls around Boston. But when I was out playing bridge, I was invited out to right near Wheaton High School, bridge one night, and we got into a big discussion, maybe 20 people, 5 tables of bridge. We got into a political discussion. Yes, I was very, very embarrassed. And everybody was interested and excited about the idea of why are we in this mess? Why is there a depression in this? And what's the solution? And it was a very simple solution. Open the warehouses and give it there. Then get started again. I had it all worked out. An easy way to solve the depression. Yeah, what else could I tell you as a memories? Be good.
Nice meeting you. How do you think the Depression affected you emotionally towards the raising of your children and dealing with other people in business and in your life now?
I don't think I could analyze characteristics, emotional characteristics, or how kids were raised. I would think that I would have not been affected by the Depression as far as my attitude toward kids. Maybe a general sense of tolerance and understanding of fellow creatures that has permeated our kids from our attitude. But I'm not sure that was not born of having a marvelous mother. As far as effect on business, I think only that in my early days in the business life, it was a question of getting jobs rather than choosing that thing that you were best able to do or wanted to do most. And so that has been more or less the score of my business life. That is that I took the opportunity that was presented itself rather than as my kids do. They go out and find the thing that they have a bent for and want to do, and they are fortunately in that sort of decision making themselves. Whereas in Depression babies, I'm sure, most of us had to take the job that was presented to us as available. As far as my general life goes, I have already told you that I'm still a depression baby in my fears of what's going to happen tomorrow, rather than my enthusiasm about the marvelous future. Always looking at, all my life I've looked for that downturn, because I lived through it in a tragic way, and now here we are, 50 years later, and never has happened. Never has happened. Generally speaking, there's been nothing but improving economic conditions and condition of life for the general public in the years that I have been looking for that terrible downturn. Sure, we've had slight recessions, but it's been, generally speaking, a build in this country. Whether we're on the verge of another one, whether my lifetime fear is going to happen, I'm not sure. The soil situation, that's all. But I think that is definitely an attitude that's born of the Depression. The Depression, I'm sure, has affected many people the same way as it has me. It has its good side, and that is that there's a great satisfaction in living and in being able to say that we were married into debt, but we got out of it as fast as we could. We have raised a family, and they're all out on their own, and we have never lived under the hammer of economic fear. We've always been on a level keel economically in the house. And even though we haven't become millionaires, there's a great satisfaction of thinking that even though I had some rough times as a teenager, watching this terrible tragedy economic tragedy in my family, we have never had it. We've not lived high off the hog, but we've been comfortable. And I'm sure that might be considered a plus value from depression impact. I still can't look at a loaf of bread and think that it's worth any more than 5 cents. That's another result of the Depression. My values still are based on what something cost at the depth of the Depression was against what it costs today. And that's, my big brother scolds me because he said, "Jim, you're always living in yesterday instead of what it is now, and forget what it was." And of course, he's probably right. I find that I'm constantly making comparisons. We buy something, I think, what the hell, this is worth $1, you know. It shouldn't be $10 worth $10 today. That's 3 sections that you asked me.
You're an engineer now, right?
Yeah.
How did you become involved in, what made you decide to be an engineer? Was it an opportunity you had? Do you resent in any way now?
It probably is a natural bent. If I had not been considered the boy artist genius in high school, I probably should have gone to MIT, because that's, well, even after I got into world radio, and Henderson was agreeable to sending you to any school you wanted, I took courses at MIT, even when I was at world radio, mainly in service and some sales, but I studied the engineering of the products that we were using and so forth. Then, still in the end of the Depression, I got into the heating business, and started studying the background of heating and design of heating systems and so forth. And that's when I first professionally started functioning as an engineer. Then I went into the leather business, and strangely, my occupation in the leather business, due to the Second World War II and the lack of manpower, I found myself in charge of all the buying and the plant engineering and the civil engineering connected with the company. I was the boss of that whole business, and I functioned as plant engineer and production engineer just by doing it. It was again acquiring the skills and knowledge by having the requirement and studying as I needed to keep up with the challenge that I had. And strangely, I had my only connection with refrigeration was building hide houses for the leather company. And I had to become fairly knowledgeable about it because I was spending hundreds of thousands of dollars building. These were not just refrigerators like you have in the kitchen, but whole great big brick buildings that were hides were brought in, and I had to have them refrigerated to keep the hides from spoiling. And so I did that. When the leather company folded, I got into the air conditioning business because I had a personal contact at church that I was junior warden and Mr. Anderson was senior warden of the church, and I told him that I was selling myself out of a job and I'd be free in January, and he was quite concerned, and then he asked me if I wanted to talk to him about whether my abilities and his needs fitted. So I got into air conditioning, and when I got into that, that was the first and only job that I have ever been hired to do engineering. And boy, I want to tell you, I did an awful lot of phone work between the time we made our agreement and even before I went to work for him. I had gone through about everything I could get my hands on for design in refrigeration and engineering, and refrigeration and air conditioning engineering. And today I get commissioned to do some pretty important jobs. But that's curious how there again, what I was saying, the job made the talent rather than the talent the job. My kids make their talents find the job, whereas I always was the other way around. I found the job and then built the talent to fit.
Yeah. Do you ever regret the not being able to go on? That you weren't able to continue art school? What were your plans when you left Newton High School when you graduated?
Oh, I was going to become the modern, the American Michelangelo. I was going to be a great artist of the world. Not after about 3 or 4 years of the depression, of the depth of the depression. I did feel pretty hurt at the time that I was forced to leave. My room on Columbus Avenue became the Concours show place that the boys that were still painting and so forth would come and show their stuff that they'd done that week and be criticized around my bedroom. And 6 or 8 of us would get together every Saturday morning and criticize the work. But I didn't do it. I just was, crippled by my own self-pity. And I just didn't do it. And I never have.
You
So when I
painted
retire,
since
I'm
then?
going to start painting. Now I look back and know that the fact that I was forced out of art school by the Depression gave me a great chance to pity myself. And it was a silly-ass thing, because I could easily have gone on drawing and painting as an avocation, even though my main effort would have to be spent. But I just stopped. I just said, and that was, I think that's what you were looking for. That was actually an impact of my being thrown out of art school by the Depression.
No, I just noticed you used to be former commissioner of the Belmont Waterworks.
Mm-hmm.
And when was that involved? Were you involved in that?
It was about I ended my job I think it was 6 years ago, when I had been commissioner for 9 years. I was involved in Belmont politics and as precinct leader. I was pretty deeply involved in whatever happened in politics in Belmont for years, with a vow that I would never seek anything but town meeting office. That I did not seek office, that I just wanted to be sure that the kids grew up in a town that was well run. Mm-hmm. And I was sitting in a meeting one night, and the commissioner resigned and nominated me to take his place. And I didn't have any idea that it was going to happen, and I was asked immediately, will you accept the nomination if we place you in the nomination? And I said quickly yes, without much thought about it. And I enjoyed it. I enjoyed doing it very much. And probably I would still be commissioner if I hadn't been so rough on my fellow commissioners who were too old to be commissioners. And I told them they ought to get the hell out of the job and not keep running year after year when they got into their 70s. So when I got to the point where another term would take me beyond 65, I quit. Nobody thought I should, but I did. And I felt that I owed it to these men that I had abused. I mean, I abused them privately, not publicly. But I thought they should quit, and they didn't.
Okay.
But that had nothing to do with the Depression. An outgrowth of years of working in the vineyards politically here. And it just happened that somebody nominated me. I accepted and was elected without opposition. As a matter of fact, most of my political career was without opposition. When I ran, nobody ran against me. So it was I never went out campaigning. I guess the last time that I ran, there was somebody running against me. As a matter of fact, the fellow that ran against me was so nice that I recommended him when I was running. He was an awful nice guy to run against, because he was courteous and said nice things. Never any problem. And Bob was a conscientious commissioner.
Okay, well, thank you very much. This has been an interview by Dana Jackson with James Dewing, who has discussed the years of his life during the Depression with us. Thank you.